reverse, which is right now on the wrong side of the line, until the line crosses that camera too. So if we let the line cross the first camera, we have to stay there until the line has crossed the second camera, putting it again on our side of the line. The other way to cut between these two cameras is to jump ahead of the line. Starting in the first reverse, the man barely moves before we have to jump ahead of the line to avoid having it cross us, so the line cross doesn't actually happen until here. Going to the other reverse, we only have one option. Right now it's on the wrong side of the line, so we have to let the line cross us first. We can then at our leisure cut to the other reverse. And going from the other reverse on the original line, there's again only one cutting option. As the man walks, we have to cut to this camera while we're still on the same side of the line, or we'd end up alone on the wrong side of the line. So let's cut all four versions together to see which ones work better. In the first version, we stayed in the first camera and waited until the line had crossed the second camera. In the next version, we jumped ahead of the line. So as the man moves, we have to jump immediately and then wait in the next camera for the line cross. Since the woman looks nearly identical in both cameras, this is not a good cut, and both of these options give us the feeling that we're trying to escape the line. The best and most relaxed options are the two last ones. As the man walks, we're immediately on the right side of the line for the next camera, so the cut isn't motivated by trying to escape the line. Going from the opposite reverse, we can again do a fairly relaxed cut as long as we make it into the next camera before the line cross. Going back again, we likewise have four options. Starting in the same reverse, the first option again is to skip ahead of the line, so the line cross doesn't happen until here. If we let the line cross happen, we have to hold in this shot while we wait for the next camera to be on our side. But since the cut is easier and more relaxed, if we don't have to stress ahead to avoid the line, let's just have him cross it and cut to this reverse, which then becomes an over the shoulder whenever the time is right. Again from the opposite reverse, the man walks out, and we can cut to this reverse when we want, as long as we do it before the line cross here. With these things in mind, let's return to the earlier script staging between the two attorneys to look at what we were doing to manage the line. The two main cameras were this over the shoulder and this close-up, which we used to basically divide the scene in half. So as Jennifer moved between her second and first marks, both cameras stayed useful. For the part where Jennifer needed to walk from her first to her third mark, we deliberately set up these two cameras close enough together that as soon as she caused the line cross, we would have a valid camera to cut to. When she walked to her second mark in the middle, we made the choice to already be in one of these cameras so that all we'd have to do to complete the coverage was add a close-up on her, matching Damien's continuous close-up. Since we needed to get back into this camera to get her facial expression as she walked back to her first mark, we had to get back before the line crossed it, or we would have had no way to get there. Finally, as Damien left, we knew we were going to be in his close-up to cover him stopping on the way out, which is why we added the last close-up on Jennifer on this side of the line and at a matching distance. Unless we completely avoid having moving lines cross cameras, which of course works but also produces very flat blocking, we sometimes need to engineer scenes this precisely. Combined with the hinging and pivoting we have to do to manage the line for static dialogue, things can start to get pretty complicated, and almost everybody has at least some difficulty with this. But let's look at some techniques to make managing moving lines very easy. By far the easiest way to manage the line with moving characters is to simply follow the line around the scene and place cameras based on which side we believe we're on at each particular time. So if the dialogue starts here, let's add two reverses, putting us on this side of the line. Next we'll have the woman walk over here, and again add two reverses. As she moves, we either have to be in this camera, in which case we can cut to this camera when we want, and to this camera as soon as the line has crossed it. If we're starting or walking in this camera, we have to cut ahead of the line before it crosses us, or we'll end up on the wrong side. Then the man walks over to her, and for that we'll place a two-shot here. For getting into this camera, we'll have to be in this one for the walk. And as soon as the line has crossed the new camera, we can cut to it. Finally, let's have the woman walk over here, for which the line stays virtually the same, and let's add a camera of similar size and angle as this one for dialogue. So even though the line is zigzagging through the scene, this is very easy to deal with. For her walk, let's be in the camera that needs to cut ahead of the line. Just before she passes behind the man, we'll have to cut to this reverse. But we'll have to wait with cutting to the matching reverse until the line has crossed it. As the man walks over, we'll want to cut to the next two shot, which we can do as soon as the line is past it, so the man is to the left of the woman in both shots. And as the woman walks to her third stop, we've set up this camera to match the man's camera, which has now become a single shot, so we can cut the remaining dialogue between these two shots. Another method that can make dealing with moving lines easier is to stick to a major coverage angle. If we choose to generally cover the scene in this direction, what we'll do is always place cameras on the side of the line that's facing towards us. So for the first stop, the cameras go here. As the woman walks over here, we'll again place a reverse pair on our side of the line. Finally, as the man walks over here, we'll put in another reverse pair, also on the side of the line facing the major coverage side. We can do this without engaging in heavy thought, and it usually ends up cutting well. After starting on the man, the woman walks, and we go to this reverse, which she steps into and completes. Continuing the dialogue with the reverse on that line, we go back to the over the shoulder from behind the man. He walks, crossing the line immediately, and we cut to this over the shoulder, which he steps into, and the other reverse to finish the dialogue. Sticking to a major coverage angle becomes especially important when the characters are far away from each other, which can make it hard to figure out exactly which side of the line we're on. In this scene, the characters start out away from each other, after which the man walks over here. So let's make a common mistake and set up two cameras like this, which by itself honors the line. But then pan with the man as he walks to a second mark. If we draw in the line, we've now ended up with two cameras on opposite sides. What we need to do is make clear choices about which side we're on. If the line will be moving around this area, we're much safer if we stay on the good side of all positions, so let's simply move his camera over here. From above, it's very obvious, but it's an easy trap to walk into. As we looked at in the chapter on U, I, and O shapes, placing cameras so they work for as many lines as possible is the safest way to keep track of lines. To do the same with moving lines, let's create some action, but draw every character stop as if it were a separate and static character with an unmoving line, and then solve it the same way we did in that chapter. In this unnecessarily messy scene, we'll start with the characters like this, then have the blue man walk over here, and after a while have the red man walk over here. In the beginning, the woman has dialogue with them both, creating two lines. They might also have dialogue with each other, creating a line here. After the blue man has walked to his second mark, he again has dialogue with them both. For the stop where the red man has walked over to the woman, he'll of course have dialogue with her, and the blue man will add some comments. Treating each stop as a separate character, let's put in cameras starting with an internal shot on the woman, which will sandwich in between these two pairs of lines, so it'll basically work throughout the scene. Let's add two close-ups for each of the men at their first stops, and an external reverse pair to cover the first half of the scene a little wider. As the blue man has walked over here, we're more interested in these lines, so let's add a close-up here. The woman's close-up keeps working, and we can cut dialogue between the men with these two cameras, although the angle gets a little strained. When the red man has walked to his second mark, we're now only concerned with these lines. As with the blue man, we'll add a close-up on the red man, and a wide shot to function as reverse, while the woman's close-up works the same. That's it, and the only other thing we'll do is take the two close-ups on the blue man's stops, which are single shots from almost the same location, and combine them into a single camera that pans. As he walks, we'll still get the two shots we need and have his movement covered as well. So to quickly cut this together, let's start in this 3-shot. Then go to the close-up on the blue man, the close-up on the woman, and the close-up on the red man. For more personal dialogue between him and the woman, we'll cut between this reverse, which is a 2-shot, and the 3-shot. The blue man walks, and we pan with him over to his next stop, where the woman's close-up is still good. She turns back to the red man. We go to the reverse 2-shot again. The man walks, and we cut to this reverse for his arrival, which we can relax about because we're on the good side of the line throughout. To finish the dialogue here, we'll use this camera, the blue man's close-up, which was now the result of a pan instead of a lock camera. The close-up on the woman, and the close-up on the red man. So by placing phantom characters at each of the stops and then covering it as if it were static dialogue is very straightforward. A thing we did in the last scene that's worth looking more at is sandwiching cameras between lines. One would generally think that cameras placed in the middle of the scene would create more line problems, but they often end up working for both sides of the line. In this scene, the man will walk over here, so we'll sandwich the close-up on the woman between the two lines, and add a couple of reverses on the man. So starting in one of those reverses, we're in the close-up as the man walks to his second stop. With her camera between the lines, it works for both sides. This would also have solved the situation from before with the characters away from each other. If we'd drawn in the lines, we could have placed a single panning camera on the man and sandwiched her camera between the lines. The last thing we'll work with is to avoid what we'll call sweeping lines. To look at that, let's first look at a character moving between 2 points covered in 2 cameras. As he walks out of the first shot, he simply walks into the second, and we're fine because his walk creates a line here. But if we bring in a second character, we're suddenly dealing with a line going this way, and no matter how we set it up, we're going to have line problems. As the man walks out of the first shot, there's an immediate line cross and we're on the wrong side. But more than that, we have to hold in this camera until the line is past the other one. This can become a real head-scratcher. If we try to better it by moving the first camera out here, we eliminate the first line cross, but we're still forced to hold in this shot until the line crosses the other camera. We could try other combinations, but the bottom line is that any arrangement that causes the line to sweep through several cameras is going to be a headache to edit. If we return to the first script staging, we had Jennifer moving between these 2 points, and we could easily have wanted to simply do 2 over the shoulders, one here and one here. If we'd set it up like that, we would have had a long gap in our walk with no editing options. So what we did instead was modify the camera for a second stop to get them close together, giving us a camera to cut to immediately. As she walked out of the first shot, she could immediately step into the second, and we wouldn't have to wait for a line cross to finish. In order to work more with managing moving lines, we need some real situations, so let's hold for now and deal with it again on Volume 5 and 6. For the remaining part of this volume, we'll work with creating the maximum amount of depth in the frame. A frame of film is inherently two-dimensional, and shots made without any consideration about depth often come across as flat and uninteresting. But depth doesn't come automatically, and we have to work at creating the illusion of it. However, it's also an extremely creative aspect of staging because it allows us to direct the attention in and out of the frame, which gives us a whole other means of expression. Before we get started on that, we need to look at a couple of things. First of all, depth is created by arranging shots in layers or planes. So while the characters may be in a middle plane, we're bringing in some extras for a background plane, a plant for a foreground plane, and a third character in an even closer foreground plane. This is a helpful way to look at it because the way we create attention shifts between depths is really by sliding planes in and out, as here where the third character steps in and out. So the plane actually exists before we slide it into the frame. Or by shifting focus between planes, or very often by doing both at the same time. Secondly, shifting focus or racking focus is both a necessary aspect of working with depth because it's usually impossible to keep the entire scene in focus at the same time, but it's also an aspect that looks so good it's often a goal in itself. However, a crucial distinction to make here is that all we should be concerned with is creating layers. When we're blocking, it's much too early to be concerned with focus, but if we make sure to block with an eye on depth, we can have focus be one of the last decisions we make minutes before shooting. This means that if we imagine a shot where we rack focus from a clock over on a character, all we should be concerned with is creating 2 layers. At the last minute before shooting, we can then decide on how and when to rack focus. This is better because it ensures that we're always going for the most meaningful compositions, and racking focus then simply becomes icing on the cake. So in the next chapters, we'll work exclusively with staging for depth, and then take the discussion on focus afterwards. Before we get into the really interesting ways to use depth, let's work with foreground and background planes. Many shots can be helped by either putting something in the foreground or by finding something to shoot through. Here we're bringing in a plant, but it could be anything, and it's usually much less intrusive than one would think because the focus on the characters will blur it out. We'll call this arbitrary foreground because it's almost irrelevant what it is. Here the characters are at a party, but let's bring some partygoers into the foreground, which helps the main characters blend in as well as enhances the depth. Here we framed a phone in the foreground as the man walks into the scene. Here we've placed a lamp in the foreground for no other reason than creating depth. But having it continue outside the frame also makes the scene part of a real world, as we looked at in the chapter on open and closed framings. The more foreground we put in, the more we often get the sense of hiding behind something. Here the branches simply create interesting foreground, but if we put them very close together, we get the classic stalker shot where we're really seeing the scene from a bad guy's POV. The other way to do this is to place cameras to get objects on the set into the foreground. Here the characters are having dialogue between some columns, and we could of course frame it like this, which is quite flat. So let's move over here to get one of the columns in the foreground. Here we're framing the car in the foreground. Or we could move over here to get the fence in the foreground too. When we're using fixed objects for foreground, it's best if we can work it out in advance so we can weave it into the camera plot without having to make big changes on the set. A more explicit way to create foreground is to create frames within the frame. This is a great framing tool even if we're not using it to get depth, as here where the character is standing in a doorway and on the same plane. But the same type of shot from outside a room uses the doorway to make a frame within the frame, with the edges of the doorway as arbitrary foreground, creating a separate layer. Frames within the frame very effectively direct our attention. Here we're shooting through a door that's barely open, and since there's nothing else to look at, that's where our attention goes. Returning to the shot with the columns in the foreground, we're really masking out part of the frame. If we mask it out more, we're deliberately directing our attention to the right. We can use anything to create a frame within the frame. Here we're using two characters to frame the third character in the background. Here we're framing the man inside the arm of the lamp. Here we're using a gap in the foreground created by the man to frame the woman in the background. Very overt use of foreground is best to plan ahead of time so it's built into the blocking. But we can very often simply modify a shot to create a frame within a frame with no particular impact on the camera plot, which is easily done on the set. Here we have a shot on a man working at a panel of computers, and the screens already provide decent foreground. But without really changing the blocking, we can instead frame the shot between the two screens, creating a frame and directing our attention towards the man. The last kind of foreground we'll look at for now is moving foreground. If we're shooting dialogue between the characters, it's very easy to create a plane of extras that occasionally pass through the shot and bring added depth. This really works the same with background, so if we start that plane moving too, we now have 3 layers of depth, 2 of them arbitrary. Whether it's foreground or background, it can be very effective to include extras in the blocking as if they were main characters, except that they have no function. To do that with foreground, the 2 men will have dialogue deeper into the scene, but we'll place an arbitrary character out front, which gives both depth and ambience. So the shot is framed to include her, even though she has no function in the scene. However, when we're placing a well-framed arbitrary character close to the camera, we often seem to imply a meaning and significance that might not be there. But as background, it's very decorative to incorporate extras into the blocking and use them to fill in gaps in the framing. Here we've set up for 2 character dialogue, and with that down, let's bring in a couple of extras as part of the framing. We've already been doing this habitually, as in this scene from Temporal Continuity where the woman walks in and we cut to the man's shot where we've built 2 extras into the framing. Or in this shot from the same chapter where the man steps into the shot. Or in this shot from Expanding and Contracting Time where we pan with the man as he walks in, having deliberately placed the extras in the background as part of the framing. This, of course, works just as well with props. In this shot from Motivations for Stopping, the woman leaves the conversation but stops on the way out. We've placed the piece of furniture in the background to fit with her stop to get a more deliberate framing. This is very easy and can be a late decision because after having set up the shot we want, all we have to do is begin decorating the frame to make it perfect. Lastly, we might not always have control over the background itself, in which case it makes sense to frame for the most pleasing part of it. In this scene, we're framing for the ocean, and the subtle movement from the waves will add a nice level to the shot. Where in the last chapter we had one central plane and used foreground and background to create depth, deep staging is creating depth with the characters and meaningful objects that are actively part of the scene. Deep staging creates very vivid and three-dimensional staging that's richer and more fun to watch because the shot takes longer to read, so it can stay on screen longer. As the eye scans the frame, we might start by looking at the man, then at the two characters here, then discover the blue woman in the background, and then discover the red woman's facial expression. Our attention goes to the man as he talks, then to the woman in the background for her dialogue, and we might take a quick glance at the extra. By now we'll have gone for half a minute without a single cut and without getting bored. In contrast, a single shot has only one layer and gets tired much faster. Deep staging shots are much more engaging because we capture more than one story in the same shot. As the men talk with each other, the woman is thinking about something else. By layering it instead of doing two separate shots, as we're trying to follow both stories at the same time, we're participating instead of just watching. What makes deep staging dynamic is that we're creating distinct layers of meaning. If the sign had been a bush, our eyes wouldn't be scanning in and out of the frame to read it. We could, of course, place everything on the same plane, but by using depth, we tell a story more clearly by showing the audience the distinct layers they need to be concerned with. There are really two sides to deep staging. The first creating static and self-contained deep staging as we just did, and the second creating attention shifts between depths by having characters or objects move in and out of shots. We'll split this over two chapters, starting with static deep staging. To do deep staging, all we have to do is get in the habit of telling more than one story at the same time and arrange stories in layers to create maximum depth. Here, two doctors are talking about a patient in a coma. So an obvious choice is to bring the doctors over here and shoot it as two layers. As the doctors talk about whether or not to pull the plug, notice again how the eyes read the frame. This is extremely effective, and with just two layers, the shot is more than twice as compelling. Even more so as the man suddenly lifts his head. He sits up, and our attention is torn between the layers, until the doctors finally see him moving and turn in amazement, after which most of the attention is on the back layer. In the meanwhile, we've completely forgotten to edit. The more we separate layers with distance, the more distinct the layers become. Here the characters are lumped together on the same plane, and at some level we perceive them as one character or one unit. With the woman out here, we don't necessarily feel that the characters are more distant from each other than before. But we feel their emotions much more individually, which creates more tension or juxtaposition within the frame than if we'd done two separate shots, and is far more interesting. However, the thing about deep staging is that even if we don't have several obvious stories to combine, simply staging like this actually creates them just by the fact that we're including multiple things in one shot. Most scenes can first of all be modified to deep staging type shots simply by how we frame cameras. A useful habit is to always look for ways to include characters in each other's shots at varying depths. As soon as we get the red man in the background of the blue man's shot, the shot has two layers. Unless the red man is completely frozen, we're automatically getting two stories just by the fact that he's standing there and reacting to the scene. Again over here, the red woman is talking to the blue man, but let's frame the shot to include the blue woman in the background, and also position the extra to conveniently fill the gap in the frame. As we cut the dialogue, each shot is far more dynamic and complex. This, of course, works the same with getting other characters into the foreground, as in this shot, which is primarily the woman's shot, but includes the other character in an open framing. Another way is to place other characters in gaps in the frame, the same as we've done with extras. Here the main dialogue is between these two characters, with the blue woman occasionally participating. So to pick a mark for her, we'll place her in the gap in the frame. This is also what we did with the doctors, except the shot was a right-angle master, but the placement of characters in the empty space was the same. On a larger scale, a useful way to look at this way of staging is as painting the frame with characters. Here the central characters are seated around a table, and we need to find a way to position all the supporting characters and extras which are currently standing haphazardly. So to again stage by filling gaps in the frame, we'll move the blue man over here, the blue woman over here, these two extras over here, and this extra over here. Likewise, in this shot, we started with the central characters in the front and positioned the blue characters at varying depths to fit with the gaps in the frame. A third deep staging technique, which is perhaps the most three-dimensionally vivid, is staggered staging. It's based on the centuries-old idea that an S-shaped curve weaving into the depth of the image creates a very pleasing composition that comfortably guides the eye. How this translates to staging is that we get the same effect by arranging characters in a staggered or zigzag fashion. Just as in the picture from before, the S-curve guides the eye into the frame and also does a great job at creating depth. This scene is mostly theoretical and may be a little on the nose. But used like this, the staggered placement of characters creates a very deep and elegant composition. The fourth technique for setting up deep staging comes from the idea that the space closest to the camera is the most private or confidential. Placing a character here allows us to identify much more with her than the others, and it can be useful to set up shots for that specific purpose. Anytime a character is within this area, we get a personal and private view. If we're with a team of bank robbers preparing a heist, and we know that someone may be an informant, having the red man walk over here where only we can see his face is very telling, even if it's just for a moment. So of course, this type of deep staging is a natural part of intimacy, honesty, and power because we get to see what nobody is really supposed to see. But regardless of how we compose deep staging shots, the question is how to integrate them into the blocking. Usually a scene will have only a couple, and because they're the most complicated, they need to go in first. Returning to the scene with the doctors, we'll assume that there's more action than just this shot, but we'll plan that one first and build the scene around it. Before that, we'll have the blue man prepare some instruments on a small table, so we'll set up a single shot for that. Let's have the woman start over here, facing away, and set up a second deep staging shot with him in the far background. While they're in these positions, the first deep staging shot only contains the patient. We'll have the man be the first to step into that shot and cut some dialogue between these two cameras. As the woman also steps into that shot, this is now our only camera. As the patient suddenly wakes up, we'll have them walk over to the bed, and a little later have the woman walk over to the desk to call someone on the